Sourdough definitely takes time, but in the middle of busy days, batch baking is one of those things that makes things so much easier. Today, I'm showing you how to make a big batch of my favorite sourdough brioche dough and turning it into 3 different sweet bakes you can make from that exact same dough. Okay, so I have everything ready to make the brioche dough. I absolutely love this dough. It's quite a classic brioche dough, but with ratios of ingredients that I find work the best in my opinion. We're just going to mix it all up in a stand mixer. Then we're going to do 3 or maybe 2 sets of stretch and folds depending on how much time I'll have. And then we're going to let it bulk ferment for around 6 to 8 hours, I would say, now that my kitchen is quite hot because the summer is approaching. But if you have a colder kitchen, it could easily go up by 12, maybe even 14. I find that brioche dough, since it contains butter, so some fat, it's very hard to over ferment. So when you're in doubt for brioche dough, it's always a good idea to ferment it a bit longer. And if you're a beginner, ferment it a bit longer than you think it needs to ferment. I think that's a great advice to follow. I'm starting by measuring out the ingredients for the dough. This is a brioche style dough, so instead of water, I'm using milk, and I'm also adding some sugar, salt, eggs, and of course, sourdough starter. I'm skipping the step of mixing those together just because I think it's unnecessary, and I'm just adding the flour on top of everything, and you'll see it mixes nicely this way too. You can easily do a double batch or even a triple batch of this recipe. I usually do double because that's what fits my stand mixer best. I did a single batch, by the way, right now. But you can easily double it. I find that if I put it into the fridge after the bulk fermentation, I can use it after 2 days and the end result still isn't that sour. It's actually not more sour, I would say, but after 2 days, you really get that sourness kicking in. So maybe do a double batch and make something of it the same day or the next day, and then you can use the other half of the dough after 2 days. So it's a really great dough to have on hand. Once I've got everything measured, I just turn the stand mixer on. I add the butter in after the rest of the dough has started to come together a bit. A lot of recipes say to add the butter slowly, but I just kind of dump it all in. I mean, I don't throw it in so it flies everywhere or anything, but I don't wait between additions either. This dough starts out very dry, but as the butter mixes in, it becomes quite wet. In my mixer, it never actually forms a perfect dough ball. It stays a little sticky and clings to the sides. So after about 10 minutes of mixing, I stop and scrape down the bowl, then move the dough into a clean bowl for stretch and fold and bulk fermentation. You saw that the dough is quite elastic and well developed straight after mixing in the stand mixer, but it's not quite where we want it yet. Bulk fermentation will take care of it though. It's not strictly necessary, but I do recommend doing at least 2 rounds of stretch and folds in the first couple of hours of bulk fermentation. It doesn't really matter when, just somewhere early on. It helps straighten the dough just a bit more. That said, we're using all-purpose flour here, which is very forgiving. So even if you skip the stretch and folds entirely, you should still end up with a great result. The mixer already develops quite a bit of gluten on its own. You can absolutely make this dough without a stand mixer. Just mix everything by hand in a bowl, but in that case, stretch and folds are essential. So I'd suggest doing 3 rounds of stretch and folds spaced out in the first 2 hours of bulk fermentation. One thing to remember if you're mixing by hand, after you mix the dough, let it rest for about 30 minutes before adding anything else. That gives the flour time to hydrate properly, which makes the dough easier to work with. From there, you can just follow the rest of the process like you would with the stand mixer version. The first thing, and honestly the thing I make most often with this dough, is cinnamon rolls. Lately, I've been loving a thicker version with more dough and more filling in every bite, so that's why I started to call them jumbo rolls. What I usually do is roll the dough out halfway, then melt the chocolate, butter, and sugar together on the stove because that filling needs a few minutes to cool down before spreading it anyway. And while that's cooling, the dough gets a chance to relax a bit, which makes it way easier to roll out fully without it springing back. While rolling out the dough, I'm just doing some stretch and folds on a different bread dough that I had going that day. For the filling for these cinnamon rolls, I'm keeping it really simple. You just melt some kind of dark chocolate, either chocolate chips or chopped from a block, together with some butter. Once that's melted, turn off the heat and stir in sugar and cocoa powder. It might look a little grainy, but that doesn't matter at all for the final bake, so don't worry about it. What you're aiming for is a paste-like consistency, so something you can easily spread over the rolled out dough without it being too runny or stiff. This is actually the same filling I used for a sourdough babka I made the other day, and I liked it so much I used it here too for these cinnamon rolls. By the way, I'll link all the recipes in the description box below so you can go to my blog, stretchandfolds.com, and print them out easily. What's really interesting is that the process I'm showing you is pretty much the same for babka and for rolls, up to the point where filling is spread out over the dough. So the dough is the same, the filling's the same, even the method is the same. The only thing that's different is the shaping. For babka, you roll the dough into a log, slice it down the middle, twist the two strands, let it rise, and then bake. For these rolls, I cut the dough into strips, shape them into individual rolls, let them puff up a bit, and then bake. So it's really just the shaping that's different. This is something I talk about on this channel a lot, not overcomplicating cooking or baking, especially sourdough. Because if you try to follow all the advice out there, it can start to feel overwhelming fast. But the basic principles are actually pretty simple. And once you understand those, you can do a lot with just one dough. That's honestly how I ended up making this video, because I think most people don't realize how flexible sourdough baking can be. You don't need 10 different dough recipes or 10 different techniques. If you know the fundamentals, you can make all sorts of things just with one base. And in this case, it's making sourdough brioche dough and knowing approximately which shapes you can get it into. This part is totally optional, but I think the rolls bake up even better if you pour a bit of cream over them before baking. I usually have some cream in the fridge that needs using up anyway, so that's often what ends up happening. The rolls bake up beautifully that way, and something worth mentioning is that they're actually easier to make if you don't roll the dough out too thin. They're much easier to handle that way, especially if you're new to sourdough or just making these for the first time. So I definitely recommend starting with a thicker rollout. You can always go thinner next time if you prefer, but this way you're setting yourself up for success right from the start. Now we're moving on to the second recipe, sourdough crescent rolls. I'm working with a big blob of dough here. This was actually a triple batch of brioche. I just cut off what I needed for the rolls. I like to wait first, so I'm not surprised by how many I end up with. It just helps me plan ahead a bit better. It's not necessary though. As you saw, this dough came straight from the fridge, and for shaping, I actually prefer it that way. It's firmer, which makes it easier to handle, even if it's a bit tougher to roll out. But since we're not rolling it out in for these crescent rolls, that's totally fine. This batch also turned out slightly stickier than usual, so I floured my work surface a bit more generously than I normally would. And that's something I wanted to point out. Recipes often tell you to lightly flour or heavily flour your surface, but honestly, just use your best judgment. You're the one handling the dough. If it's sticking, go ahead and flour the surface. If it's not, there's really no need. Flouring is only useful for preventing sticking, so there's no other benefit. In fact, too much flour can be a downside. If you're rolling up dough with filling, for example, too much flour between the layers can keep them from sticking together, so they won't bake up as nicely. So just be mindful. Use flour if you need it, but don't add it just because you feel like you're supposed to. You can also let the dough come to room temperature before shaping. That really depends on the texture you like to work with. The final bake will turn out the same either way. It's not like there's a ton of fermentation happening in that time. To shape these crescent rolls, I start by rolling the dough into a large rectangle, then I cut it into wide strips. From there, I slice those strips diagonally to get triangle shapes, about 10 of them, and then I just roll them up into crescents. One thing to keep in mind with this brioche dough, just like I said during the bulk fermentation, it's actually pretty hard to overproof, and that also applies to the second rise. If you're used to baking bread, you probably expect the second rise to be done in 2 to 4 hours at room temperature. But with this dough, I found it really benefits from going longer. So if your kitchen is a normal temperature, let's say, I'd say aim for more like 4 to 6 hours. If it's hot, you might lean toward the shorter end of that range, but if it's cooler, the second rise can stretch out for most of the day actually. You can shape something in the morning and bake it fresh in the afternoon or even save it for the evening as a treat. As the dough proofs, you'll notice it gets puffier and puffier. I don't think I've ever had this dough overproof on me, honestly. The best results always come when it's really nice and puffy right before going into the oven. As you can see, sourdough is incredibly flexible. There's very little hands-on time, and then it's just wild yeast and bacteria doing their thing while you go about your day. That flexibility is one of the things I've come to love most about sourdough. It really opens up once you stop trying to control every step. It's not like commercial yeast when the timing has to be exact. You can actually shift things around your schedule, especially with enriched doughs like this one. And that's what I tell people when they ask me why I bother with sourdough when life is already so busy. Because honestly, it fits into my life better than most types of baking. I can do a bit in the morning, walk away, come back to it later. It doesn't feel like a task, it just becomes part of the rhythm of the kitchen. And I used to think I had to get everything exactly right, but sourdough has a way of teaching you to let go of that. The dough changes with the seasons, with the flour. It's always just a bit different, and you always have to figure it out again. The best thing I ever did for my sourdough routine was to stop following rigid schedules. Stop trying to follow every recipe to a T. I just started baking often and learned a lot. It doesn't have to be perfect, you just have to be consistent. And like anything else, the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. You'll learn way more by baking regularly than by reading a dozen recipes and never actually getting your hands in the dough. Next up, I'm making sourdough cardamom buns. Something that's been on my list forever, but I just kept forgetting to buy cardamom at the store. It's just not something I usually have on hand. Where I live, it's kind of a exotic spice. We don't really use it much. But the other day we went to IKEA and I tried their cinnamon rolls. At least I think they still call them cinnamon rolls. And they had this really pleasant flavor that wasn't just cinnamon. I asked what it was and turns out it was cardamom. So I finally picked some up and I used it in this recipe. And it turned out so well that I actually posted the recipe on my blog after just one try, which I never do. Normally, I test things a few times to really nail them, but this one just worked perfectly right away. I'll, of course, leave the link to the recipe in the description below if you want to try it too. Even though these buns look really elaborate once they're baked, all braided and twisted and beautiful, the shaping isn't actually that complicated. One tip I'd give is roll the dough out thinner than you might think. I probably could have rolled mine even thinner than I did here. They puff up quite a bit in the oven, and with all those twists, a thicker layer of filling can start to leak out. It wasn't a big issue for me this time, there was just a little leakage, but next time I'll roll the dough out thinner and then spread the filling in a thinner layer too, just to keep everything a bit tidier. To shape them, you roll the dough into a rectangle, spread the filling over one half, then fold the dough over to cover it. After that, you cut it into 8 to 10 long strips, depending on how big you want your buns to be. Each of those strips then gets sliced in half lengthwise, but not all the way through. You want to leave one end connected so the two strands are still attached at the top, if that makes sense. Then you twist each of those two strands and finally twist those two twisted strands around each other into a kind of a knot. That was a tongue twister. I honestly am not sure what the official method is for shaping cardamom buns. There seems to be a dozen ways to do it. I looked up a few tutorials and just winged it from there. They're one of those things that you feel will turn out horrible when you're making them, but somehow they don't. So you can go into this confident, and I think it will turn out just fine. Just like with the other bakes, the second rise for these cardamom buns can take a while. I let them rise for about 6 hours, and they definitely doubled in size before baking. We ended up eating about half of them the same day, and I froze the rest so I could test how well they defrost and include that info into the blog post too. If you're feeling a bit intimidated by sourdough sweet bakes, I really think this brioche dough is the perfect starting point because it's so versatile and very easy to make. You can use it for dinner rolls, cinnamon rolls, sweet buns, anything that calls for a richer, slightly sweet dough. It's truly a great one to have in your rotation. And just to circle back to something I mentioned earlier and leave you with some encouragement, just start baking sourdough. So many people spend ages reading about it online, learning all the terminology, trying to understand each step. And that way, it can start to feel like this big, complicated science project. But the truth is, you don't even have to understand everything to get started. If you think about it, our ancestors didn't know what bacteria or wild yeasts were, at least not in the way we do now. They didn't understand the science behind fermentation necessarily, but they still made incredible bread. So if you haven't started yet, just start. You'll learn as you go, and that's really the only way to figure it out. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more videos on sourdough baking, food from scratch, and natural living, make sure to hit subscribe, and I'll see you next Friday. Bye!